Sound check here, Tony. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I was in early so you could hear me and I could hear you.
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear. I'm just turning the live stream on as well. So you will be live streamed to the public here in 2 seconds.
Gerald, I believe Ryan will be running the PowerPoint, but we'll just confirm when he gets back.
That's correct. We'll handle the PowerPoints for you on this end. Good afternoon, Councillor Croson, Acting Mayor Croson, sorry. See you online. We've just begun the live stream and we're T-minus 6 minutes away.
Thank you for the warning. I will behave myself.
It's been so long since I've seen you, Graham. I like your haircut.
I appreciate that, Councillor Kaufman, because I did it myself, and I'm feeling pretty good about it, actually.
Oh, nice job. Yeah.
As good as, I mean, you've got a pretty bad view of it based on the blurry background and the delayed response of the internet and all that, but you might have a different opinion if I was a little closer or in person, but from here I think it looks okay.
Well, then we'll continue.
I can confirm that. I just walked past Graham.
Yeah.
I'll take the city manager's advice on that. And sorry, to not feel left out, your hair looks good too, Mr. Gauthier.
What little of it that there is. Thank you.
I offered to cut his hair too, but he was pretty resistant, so I don't know.
Graham, I'm in. It should take you about 3 seconds. You just zip it.
There we go. I make no promises though. About
I haven't paid for a haircut since 2007.
Yeah.
When you've got 42 hairs to cut, and I think the last time I went to a salon, it cost me $42, including tip.
$1 per hair.
That's exactly.
Wow. Yeah. So the funny thing is, I didn't actually need to change at all during the pandemic. I've been cutting my own hair mostly for 20 years. So now it just doesn't look as bad because everyone's is kind of in the same. we're all kind of in the same boat.
We know the feeling. Alrighty, it's 1:31, so we're already a minute behind schedule. I'll call the meeting of Governance SPC for Thursday, May 27th to order. Start with the acknowledgement statement. The City of Lethbridge acknowledges that we're gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains, and we pay respect to the Blackfoot people past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationships to the land. The City of Lethbridge is also located within Region 3 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. Did I see you online? Bonnie, are you our the one keeping us in line today?
Nope, I'm here, but Ryan's there as clerk today.
Oh, sorry, Mr. West. I missed your Ryan W on the screen there. So could you do a roll call, please?
Certainly, no problem at all. Councillor Carlson.
Present.
Councillor Morrow.
Yeah.
Acting Mayor Croson.
Present.
Councillor Kaufman.
Present.
All present and accounted for. Also online is Councillor Higgin and several members of administration in the room here, myself and Ms. Moncrief.
Thank you. I also
And
see
Deputy Mayor Campbell.
whose camera.
My apologies. There was a camera on and I didn't even notice it. Sorry, Deputy Mayor.
He's in camouflage.
Thank you. Welcome all. Thank you, Councillors Higgin and Councillor Higgin and Deputy Mayor Campbell for attending as well today. We'll move then to the agenda. Is there anything anybody wishes to add to the agenda? Okay, hearing none. I've got a motion from Councillor Croson. Be it resolved that the agenda of the regular meeting of the Governance Standing Policy Committee on May 27th, 2021 be adopted as presented. Councillor
Question.
Croson. Question's been called. Are any opposed? That carries unanimously. And I am going to have to switch now between devices. My apology for my screen going off. Consent agenda. I have a motion from Councillor Carlson. Be it resolved, the minutes of the Governance Standing Policy Committee held on Thursday, April 22nd, 2021 be approved, and the chair and clerk designate be authorized to sign the same. And further be it resolved that the Governance Standing Policy Committee received for information the status of initiatives for May 27th, 2021. Councillor Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reviewed the minutes. I didn't notice anything. I'm not sure if any other members of the committee saw anything. Are there any questions on the status of initiatives?
I would just ask if the city manager has anything on the status of initiatives that he wishes to highlight.
No, I don't, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
Mr. Chair, perhaps the one thing, N93 and 94, I thought at one point OEG, the previous iteration of this committee, dealt with those by saying we're not going to be looking into them at this time. And so I'm just wondering if I'm misremembering or if we can deal with those. They've been on the books since budget 3 years ago. So I'm just wondering if we can get rid of those, move them, close the loop. I'm just not sure. They've been there for a long time.
Absolutely. Mr. Westerson or Ms. Hilford, do either of you recall the conversation? Because we're not going to go by my memory.
What's included on there was a postponement of these to a future meeting once the governance review was implemented. Don't necessarily recall that, but we can do a deep dive into some of the past meetings of OEG just to take a peek.
And I do recall that as well, because we didn't want any conflict with the governance review when we were going to be looking at those resolutions of council.
Okay, thank you. Just for a reminder of the committee and anyone else who's interested, those are the two regarding full-time and part-time councillors, correct? We have funds allocated for those, I believe, as well. If it is not expended by the end of the cycle, I'm assuming then those funds go back into MRSR or for expenditure next cycle, correct?
That I don't know.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Do we want to make note then on this, an additional to your motion then, Councillor Carlson, further be resolved that city manager or administration, however we wish to list that, will report back at the next meeting regarding N93, 94?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd appreciate that. I think we need to take care of these in whichever manner we want to before the next council is sworn in, whether it's providing them with any information we've gleaned or saying we didn't have time to look at these, but it's something you may want to explore during your budget discussions.
Okay. Just wait a moment while that change is then being added to the motion. Thank you very much. Was that Ms. Moncrief who did that?
Yes, it was.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Moncrief, for that. So we've got an amendment to this then as well. Further be resolved that administration provide an update regarding initiatives N93 for full-time councillors and N94 full-time councillors at the June 24th, 2021 meeting of the Governance Standing Policy Committee. Councillor Carlson.
Thank you. I saw Miss Hilford had her.
Yes, if I can ask, what kind of update is a committee looking for regarding these two initiatives? Just more information so that we can provide the right information at committee meeting on June 24th?
I do believe that we had a conversation, Councillor Carlson is correct, we had a conversation about these two, but unfortunately, what the decision was at the time, or you know, to when we were to move these forward, or the conversation to have after the governance review was done, that's, I think, the information's eluding us at the moment.
Thank you.
So thank you. So if it's something we need to address, then at our next meeting in terms of creating a clear decision on it, then that should be on the next governance agenda in June.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's my intent, at least to bring it forward, to have the discussion. We can close the loop on this with whatever direction the committee deems. And so if there's nothing further, I'll call for the vote.
I just want to make sure, Councillor Morrow.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask that we split this resolution. Leave the last further be it resolved. I'd like to vote on these separate if possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I've got a motion to divide. I'll just accept that as a consensus decision if we're okay. So I believe I'm trying to adjust my screen and it's not my screen I can adjust. So we'll vote on the first two operative clauses together, and we will vote on the third one, the amendment, as a separate vote.
No opposition to division, but I'll call for the vote.
Just before you do that, are there any other questions either about the minutes or the governance, the status of initiatives? Okay, hearing none, and we'll just wait until we've got everything set there on the screen. If you want Ms. Moncrief after motion defied, the chair has made the decision that it's just by consensus. We'll agree to that. Thank you. All right, I heard the question called. So on the first two operative clauses to approve the minutes as well as the status of initiatives, are there any opposed? Okay, that's carried unanimously. Then on the second, or on part two, be it resolved that administration provide an update regarding initiatives N93 for full-time counselors and N94 full-time counselors at the June 24th, 2021 meeting of the Governance Standing Policy Committee. Are there any opposed?
I am. Joe.
Thank you. Councillor Morrow. Councillor Croson, in favor or opposed?
In favor.
Councillor Carlson, in favor or opposed?
In favor.
And Councillor Kaufman is also in favor. Thank you. That motion carries. Mr. Westerson, you and Ms. Moncrief got the vote on part two?
Yes, we did. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, that being the case, we will move into item 4.1, planning documents alignment framework. Mr. City Manager.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just briefly before turning it over to Mr. Van den Heuvel and team, that both 4.1 and 4.2 are items that we wanted to bring to the committee to receive as information, but to have a conversation and a discussion, and to get any direction, thoughts, and or advice from committee members. Both of these initiatives stem directly from the KPMG operational review and the what I've said a number of times, what I consider to be the most important citywide recommendation, and that's the recommendation related to implementing a performance management framework, which really speaks to how are we expected to do business as a city. And so clearly performance management starts with council, and it's linked directly to council's roles and duties as outlined in the MGA in terms of being responsible for determining what services provided to citizens, determining what service levels are associated with those services, and for actually monitoring and being mindful of the performance of the corporation. And so both of these two items speak to that. This is work that the Office of Organizational Performance and Continuous Improvement has been working at quite diligently in the background. And our intent is, by the time the next council is formed, is to have a performance management in place that will facilitate the orientation and transition to a new council, and ideally get us off to a good start on their 4-year mandate with a clear common understanding of what goals and objectives council hopes to achieve, and then having a performance management framework in place to deliver on and report on that work. So these two pieces have fallen out of OPCI's work, and we look forward to the engagement of the committee today, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Vandenhoeven.
Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Just before to Mr. Vandenhoeven, just this is a follow-up as well as part of the conversation that City Council had during CIP on planning documents. It ties into that conversation as well, correct?
That's correct. The specific conversation around master plans, where they fit, what their role is, and thanks for that question, because 4.1 speaks to this notion that we believe we should have a clear understanding of council's thoughts on what master plans, what planning guidance needs to exist to guide the operations of the city. And right now that there are 25 plus master plans out there, and there's a degree of randomness in terms of the format, what they were designed to achieve. Some have been received and filed, others have been approved. And so really a clear roadmap so that council's clear about what the role of those guidance documents is or are, and administration can respond to that, we think is critical. And it gets to the notion that came up in the CIP conversation too, around the weaponization of master plans, what's council's role. And so this is also an effort to address those questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vandenhoeven.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Graham right away, but I just want to echo what the city manager indicated, that the work that we've been doing here is in the spirit of continuous improvement. And we've been listening to council and hearing bits from council about what angst has been created by different processes and such. So we've put together some ideas in these next two presentations, but the success of the integrated performance management framework is very much dependent upon the clarity and the leadership that's provided by council. So we look forward to receiving your feedback and your input on those two, and we'll continue to go take what we learned in here today, go back and continue to progress so that we are ready to stand this up fully in November of 2021. So with that, I'll turn it over to Graham Woods, and he'll take us through the first presentation on planning alignment framework.
Thank you, and good afternoon. A little bit new for me, but Ms. Moncrief, can you click to the next slide? And I'll try to adapt to this digital presentation format. We're here today to present and discuss improvements or potential improvements we're working on to the planning alignment framework, and to begin to address what happens between council direction and service delivery. And next slide, please. We've tried to separate the types of council decision into two. One being, or the first being, decisions for planning purposes, and the second for council implementation purposes. And I have a slide later in the presentation to help explain that distinction that we're trying to make. There has been, as the city manager said, some projects or sources to guide us in this work. The first was the operational review phase 1, which
which identified the absence of a citywide formalized performance management framework and the recommendation to introduce one. The information on this slide is from the operational review phase 1, and it identifies that alignment is actually the first piece of an effective performance management framework. And we have to be able to connect our work, all city employees' work, that we do to the city's priorities as they've been established by council. It is required at that alignment piece. It's also required as it moves from alignment to measurement. One of the things that we actually need to measure is how well that alignment is working. And next slide, please. The second source for this work is the governance review. And the governance review gave us several recommendations, one of which was to improve council onboarding in general. And in particular, it does apply to this topic area. The other thing that the governance review did was give us some recommendations to address master plans and council's desire to improve the way master plans are organized, scoped, launched, and progress under council's guidance. This slide was, there are 2 quotes on this slide from the governance review final report. Next slide, please. But this slide is also from the governance review, was not included in the final report. I think that the members of council who would have seen this would have been the members from the previous OEG group that provided guidance to this and oversight to this project. This statement was provided by our consulting team after they had interviewed council and administration, or some members of administration, where both council and administration expressed frustration with master plans in general, master planning process, and the lack of clarity about master plans. So next slide, please. So where we're at right now is that there is some semblance of a planning framework. It's not formalized and may not be fully understood or followed at the city of Lethbridge. And the key message here, though, is there are all sorts of opportunities for improvement on it. And next slide, please. So where we want to head and where we are heading is to improve the alignment of plans by better defining the purpose and authority of each type of plan, ensuring that council provides the appropriate direction, increasing clarity, creating consistency, improving quality, and increasing accountability. This is where we're headed. There is work already underway moving us in this direction. And next slide, please. In order to have the conversation with governance committee today, we tried to divide the framework into components, 5 components. 2 of them are really just for context, and that's the first one and the fourth one. And where we want to focus our discussion today, I think, is on the council touch points, which would be 2, 3, and 5, the council planning decisions, council implementation decisions, and reporting and accountability. Next slide, please. So that context is given to us, or the authority is given to us from the province, mainly through the MGA and the land use framework, but also dozens of other issue or service-specific legislation, regulations, or regulatory bodies. Next slide, please. The council then sets direction for the community and administration through the municipal development plan, the council strategic plan, and master plans, acknowledging, though, that in addition to these 3 plans or planning areas, council can set direction at any time through a resolution, and sometimes does. Next slide, please. In terms of decision-making, council has 2 mechanisms to do that, bylaws and resolutions. But these can take many different forms, and just a short list of those would be the statutory plans, budgets, council policies, or any different type of form of bylaw or resolution. Next slide, please. To help clarify the distinction that we're attempting to make in this presentation between planning decisions and implementation decisions, I'd like to use the example of the new or almost ready fire hall in Southwest Lethbridge. Council received the fire master plan, and the top bullet on this slide is a quote from that master plan. And the resolution says received and filed. The master plan identified the need to add a fire hall, its approximate location, and the desired time frame. But Council's receiving of the master plan did not approve the construction of the fire hall. And next slide, please. It wasn't until the next CIP that Council approved the funding, timing, scope, location, and operating budget associated with that new fire hall. And this slide is the resolution from Finance Committee at CIP. And so we're making that distinction between two different types of decisions here. Next slide, please. The next component is the administrative plans, or the hierarchy of plans at the administrative level. At the top of that hierarchy is the corporate strategic plan, and it flows into division plans and department plans. The common or main department plan are business plans. There are other types of, potentially depending on the needs of the department, other types of department plans, business plans being the common one. Next slide, please. And the last piece of this framework is reporting and accountability, and that shows up in the form of work plan reporting and performance reporting. And next slide, please. So this slide is a visual summary of those previous slides. It's created for this discussion. It is not a workflow. It's not intended to be viewed that way. At the top of the slide is the provincial direction, which leads us to the council planning documents. And moving towards council implementation decisions, either directly or indirectly, by first having additional work completed by administration and ultimately ending up in the corporate work plan. And the corporate work plan is where every employee of the city of Lethbridge can identify what they do, because everybody either directly or indirectly participates in building and maintaining infrastructure, providing services, enforcing bylaws, or implementing change initiatives. And then at the very bottom is how that then would, the progress or performance of that corporate work plan would be reported. Ms. Moncrief, you might have to click a number of times to get to the next slide. Thank you. We believe there are improvements to be made to ensure that council's desired outcomes are being achieved at service delivery. And so part of that is to improve reporting to council. We've begun that work with improvements to reporting the corporate work plan that began in the back half of 2020. And I won't speak today yet about performance measures reporting, because that, I think, is the next agenda item, or we have an entire agenda item to talk about that. So we'll skip over that part for now. We want to improve council onboarding generally, but as it pertains to this topic, we want to better define the role and purpose of each type of plan to perhaps better set the next council up for understanding how to be effective and where to attribute the type of decisions that council wants to make to get the desired effect that they want. I think the last one on that previous slide was to improve the clarity of council resolutions. And that, again, is a general statement, but it pertains in particular to this topic area around the clarity of council resolutions for master plans and bringing more clarity about what was actually decided, what was directional or for planning purposes, and what was a decision for implementation purposes. And next slide, please. The next one is we want to develop a glossary of terms. I have an example here of that. That example would be to define master plans. The working definition is just a working definition. It's not finalized yet. But that working definition is that a master plan, at a minimum, should describe the current state and, using predictive measures, describe the future state or the desired future state of a particular service area or department. And this would include affirming or proposing changes to services, service levels, and the service delivery model, and often includes recommendations around the provision of infrastructure either the infrastructure required to maintain a level of service, or the infrastructure proposed to offer a different service or a different level of service. Number 6, at an administrative level, to establish a master plan steward, and the role of that steward would be to maintain an inventory of master plans with expected renewal dates, to maintain an inventory of projects and initiatives arising from master plans for the purpose of council reporting, to provide guidelines and advice to the departments undertaking master plans, and to help support the development of scope and monitor scope clarity throughout a project. And then next slide, please. How that really connects to council is that we're suggesting that council approve funding and authority for all master plans, and likely or potentially consider the delegation of oversight of the development of that master plan to an SPC, or not at council's discretion. Then that either council or a particular SPC would approve a more detailed scope and identify the touch points that council or SPC wants, and how they want to be involved in the plan development. As we just said, master plans must describe at a minimum the current state and the desired future state. And what we're sort of affirming here is that council would approve that, or SPC at least would approve that desired future state. From there, a list of projects, initiatives, recommendations, whatever they are, would be identified and proposed that would move us from the current state to that desired future state. And when council receives the master plan, clarity be achieved about which of those recommendations are handed or delegated to administration, likely through the authority that the city manager has already been delegated by council, and which of those items or recommendations are subject to come back to council for a future decision. Those types of decisions would be things like budget initiatives, CIP projects, bylaws, resolutions, or whatever it is that's required. There's actually probably a number 3 on this list that's not on the slide, which would be council could do those 2 things, but as well refer actually additional work to an SPC. That is the conclusion of the presentation, and hopefully has sparked a conversation at governance committee. I'm very happy to attempt to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Questions from the committee? Councillor Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Woods, for the presentation and going through it, because it makes more sense when you sort of talked us through it than me just reading it. So thank you. So I'm just trying to get a Coles Notes version in my head of the way this could possibly roll out, is that there would be some sort of master plan of master plans, so to speak. So if that makes sense, of saying, here's the work over the next decade, we'll say that needs to happen on master planning exercises. Those could be delegated to different SPCs to steward the work and provide, hopefully, council input. Then they would go back to council for just receiving, not adopting, but receiving as information, I guess. And then possibly, I think you've added the number 3, which I was going to say, then could they be delegated back to an SPC to sort of guide and bring back initiatives from them to council? Is that sort of a Coles Notes version for my brain? Or did I miss it completely?
Let me just jump in and start, and then hope that Tony and Graham don't completely contradict what I say. But there's a broader framework here, I would suggest, and master plans are a thing. There are a suite of documents that exist that provide guidance in as I said at the opening, in a somewhat random fashion today. What Graham talked about in addressing the master plan issue is part of a broader performance management framework that in its most simple sense is really what direction has been provided to administration by previous councils, by some of these documents that are already in existence. And the broader performance management framework initiative is to try and bring coherence to that. So if you fast forward to a new council coming on board in November, they would see, and I would love to see this described in policy personally. I don't know if that's the most efficient and effective way to go forward, but a new council would sit down and say, okay, we have this thing called the MGA. We have this thing called the Master Development Plan. We have decided, councils of the past have decided that these 20 master plans need to be in existence to guide the thinking of council, the decision-making of council, and also the work of administration. So they're entering an environment where work's already ongoing, priorities have already been established. And what's lacking, though, is some coherence to all of that. So then they have the opportunity to understand that and understand the framework they're operating in and imprint their or put their influence or place their influence on where the city goes over the course of their mandate. The other piece of this from a master planning perspective right now is when a new council comes together and thinks about what they want to accomplish over a 4-year period, the state of master plans and the state of some of that broad work should also be understood and considered, I would suggest. So let's say we have 20 master plans that council decides are the core planning documents that need to exist to supplement the MDP and the MGA and some of those other higher order documents. Well, we should probably have a schedule for how often those are to be done. Council should know which ones are set to expire during their term. Council might also say, you know what, a priority for us over the next 4 years is responding to climate change, just to pick an example. But maybe the particular master plan or master plans associated with that were not scheduled to be redone for a further 4, 6, 8 years. Council could say, we're going to pull those forward deliberately because they're directly related to some of our priorities that we want to focus on over a 4-year period. So for me, this is all about that broader framework and trying to get a handle on what drives what we do today from a corporation perspective, both in terms of service delivery, but more importantly, when we talk about master plans and council strategic plans, council's change agenda. So it's this hierarchy of plans notion, this one document you can turn to when you say, why are we doing this? Why is city administration out talking about this? Or why are they focusing on that? That there's actually a bit of a broader roadmap or framework that brings some clarity to that. I don't know if that helps or hurts, but that's sort of what I would like to see us work towards is this broader framework. And as Graham said, performance management really starts with council. And we need to I think we need to help council understand what that space looks like and bring coherence to their efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Dalton, because I think you call it a broader framework, a roadmap. I think that was my terminology, was a master plan of master plans. And just as an aside, I saw Chairman Kaufman's eyes light up when you mentioned policy around this. just a thought that you may have some champion there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Vanden Heuvel, did you want to respond as well? Perhaps with your mic on. Thanks.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think Councillor Carlson encapsulated a good component there and focused on the master plan. But the beginning of this is a framework that talks about alignment and creates alignment from council direction and council decision, which then allows administration to confidently go away and do the work and bring it back. And so the framework is driven by forcing clarity at every point. And the master plan example is highlighted specifically because of some of the frustrations that we've had with regards to scope, timing, reporting. What does it mean to receive and file? And if we can make improvements by clarifying our language and our structure and our process, better results will then come. And the master plans often, as you're aware, are the feeding documents for future CIP projects. And so as we look at how do we improve our capital planning and capital budgeting, you start right back at the concept thing If council can provide clarity on scope, agree on the desired future state, select the recommendations that we want, that really puts administration in a good place. And the stewardship of it is then created so that not only does it encapsulate the master plans, but as Graham said, council gives direction and decision to a number of different ways, most of those being resolutions. As those resolutions are crafted with greater clarity, we take it from the clerk's office, we put it into our workflow, and we plan and align our resources that way. And then the likelihood of us coming back to council and having missed the mark or created angst or frustration definitely lessens, and council's ability for improved decision making and bringing about the outcomes of the results they desire goes up through this framework.
Thank you, Mr. Van Hoel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Crowson.
Thank you. Some of my questions were actually answered during that. What I really like about this is I see an opportunity to really decrease siloing, because of course every department has to coordinate their master plans rather than just making their unilateral decision. And I think we've all seen in the past that council has mitigated not having a role in things. When a master plan comes, that's when you see the receive and file going, we don't know why you guys did this. We don't know what the purpose of this is. So we're just going to receive and file it. And basically it's going on a shelf somewhere. And that has been how I think council has dealt with some of this stuff. But I absolutely agree, as we're looking at things like the procedure bylaw, having a good definition of what it means when we say we're going to accept as information or receive and file or whatever it is vital, because I think that has been some of the difficulty. So it has to be connected with the procedure bylaw. But some questions I have, and I think I know the answer, but just to clarify, is this going to be on both operational and functional master plans? So operational ones, but also capital ones? Because that was a difficulty we had when the police came forward at CIP. They called something a master plan that I think everybody thought was operational, but was completely around facilities. So will it apply to both?
Go ahead, Mr. Van Den Heuvel.
Great point, and thank you for the question. I think, yes, it would apply to both, because one of the things that we, in Graham's slides, he indicates sometimes we use the term master plan. Sometimes it's a functional study. Sometimes it's a different type of planning exercise. And if we can agree on definitions, again, that will bring about the greater clarity. But regardless of the work, where the work comes from, if the work is guided and aligned by council, then it can come in through the framework and be managed in the same manner. So it would support both scenarios that you described there.
Yeah, that was the other thing I had, is going through our plans, the number of different plans that all seem to mean the same thing that have different names. Clarity on that would be incredibly helpful. And the other thing is, I know you guys are working on it, trying to figure out how many master plans we have. I'd also be curious about how many master plans we've actually implemented. I'm not asking you to go find it, but it's one of those things about, I think we have a lot of master plans that went no further than being created in some ways. And so it'd be interesting to see, and this will certainly decrease it. I'm not saying go do a study, but I think it's one of the reasons that we need to do this is because master plans have been created that went nowhere.
And I think just to layer on to a couple of Tony's comments earlier to your question, Councillor Crowson, that this would be an opportunity to really define what is a master plan and what's its purpose. And these should ultimately start and end with council. If administration needs to do work to be able to do the work that council directs it, well, that's a study or some other thing that we need to do to inform our work. But if we call everything a master plan, pretty soon we have 25, 30, 35 of these things that are out there. And if they don't start with council, then quite frankly, the system's broken. We have other parts of the system generating work when that's not the way the system's designed to function. So part of this is tightening it up, disciplining it, and focusing on really master plans as direction setting exercises on behalf of council that are aligned with their priorities. And so I think we may find in the end we only need 5. Council may decide we need 10, and these are the subject areas. And perhaps LPS is something that if council is perhaps struggling to understand how to situate infrastructure requests from LPS, perhaps that's a discrete study that needs to take place as opposed to a master plan that exists on our books forever and ever and ever, or maybe not. But those are the types of threads I think we need to pull to try and make sense of this environment.
I would imagine consultants have encouraged us to call them master plans because they can charge us a lot more for those.
Mr. Woods, did you have something to add to that as well?
I do, thank you. To Councillor Croson's point in question is one of the things that we haven't done well, or maybe at all at times, is report the progress of advancement in a master plan. And we actually have some master plans that have been really, really successful. And by and large implemented or fully implemented. And we've never actually said so. And if we go back as an example to an earlier version of the Rec and Culture Master Plan, I think Council funded and approved and ultimately built 8 of the 9 recommendations for facility renewal. A wildly successful master plan that Council, it didn't all happen in one cycle, but councils and subsequent councils agreed to and liked and funded. On the other hand, I can think of 1 or 2 master plans where Council rejected the recommendations and nothing's happened, and which suggests that not that the master plan was wrong or bad work was done, but actually it started badly. It started with the wrong trajectory and didn't fully get Council's input on where they wanted it to go. And so I think we'll address both of those. One of them is actually just to report back to Council on the progress of all of the recommendations within a master plan, and actually bringing something to the CIP and having Council say no is fine. That's progress, right? It was dealt with, and Council chose that it didn't meet in the competition for money and ideas. Might have been a good idea in a world of unlimited resources, but didn't win that competition in a world of limited resources, and I think that's okay. But in terms of the 1 or 2 master plans that I can think of that had very little or no traction at Council, that's something different, and it would suggest that those master plans launched poorly without proper direction from Council and ultimately failed because Council didn't agree to really anything in those master plans.
Yeah, and sometimes my focus is on those failures. Part of our city master plan, certainly, when you actually look through it, it's amazing how much has been accomplished in that one as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Morrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a lot of thoughts going through my mind and several questions, so please stop me when others pop in. So I'm listening to this, and I'm kind of thinking, this is all very good, and I totally understand, and I really understand the municipalities, the councils of the day have to plan for 10, 20, 50 years out. I get that. But we have elections every 4 years. So here's kind of what I'm thinking. First off, a couple questions. These master plans, I'm assuming that we have many master plans that probably have gone through 2, maybe even 3 councils where it's been created by the council of the day dealing with the situation of the day. And then 4 years later or 5 years later, a new council decides to revisit it and change it up to meet that situation of the day. And it doesn't get done. And then the 3rd council will do the same thing. So when you talk master plans, am I understanding master plans properly? I guess I'm going to ask that to Mr. Woods, because I think your presentation, that's kind of what I picked up. So maybe help me out here a bit.
Go ahead, Mr. Woods.
If the question is how long do master plans last, they often overlap multiple councils, and in those scenarios, in fact, maybe almost always, and in those scenarios, it's true that the legacy of a past council continues into the new council, or perhaps even 2 or 3 or more, because the master plan is still the last direction given by council. and new direction hasn't yet come to create authority for the administration to do anything differently. What I think, we may not have a perfect solution to that, but one of the things that the city manager did in the first answer was to at least inform a new council of the master plans and the schedule of renewal, so that an incoming council understands which master plans are scheduled to be dealt with by them. And if there's some that are outside of that plan, of the election cycle, or the cycle of the 4-year cycle of council, if a member of council, or it's the desire of council to bring it forward and renew it sooner, they at least that council is at least informed enough to make that decision about whether or not to bring something forward. Often master plans last 10 years, plus or minus, or at least 5. And so I think that may be a partial answer to your question, may not be fully satisfactory though.
No,
I'd
appreciate
like to,
it. Yeah, please.
if I could just jump in, because I think it's an important question, and it's very similar to some of the conversation that's taken place around the budgeting cycle. And that when I look at a new council being formed in November, for example, and Mr. was talked about this, there could be across our master plans right now 10, 20, 30, 40 commitments that have been made, previous council decisions that have been made, that might be planned to be carried out over the course of that next council's mandate. How would they be aware of that? How would they be aware of decisions that have already been made that not necessarily constrain them, but are going to guide the activities of administration and supporting council, similar to capital budget decisions that have been made? And without a really clear process and framework for pulling that information together in one place and letting a new council, when they show up on day one, saying, okay, here's what we want to accomplish. Oh, by the way, in the capital budget process, these funds have been allocated to these initiatives, and they're going to unfold over the course of your mandate. The Master Plan X has directed the following work to take place over the first 2 years of your mandate. That one of the things I think we need to do is find a way to make all that information available to council and inform council, not so that council can say we're going to, we want to change course. They can do that at any time, but similar to conversations around multi-year budgeting, the value of I see in master plans, and having master plans that are 5 or 10 years into the future, is you get away from that year-to-year sort of knee-jerk reaction planning, and you do think strategically. But then council of the day needs to be aware of what extant direction is out there, so that they can respond to changes in the environment and new priorities that emerge, and shifting perspectives of citizens in the community. So I think it's a dynamic process, but what we're hoping to achieve here is to package the information together better, and to have a process in place that better enables council to be aware of what guidance and decisions have been made and are out there. Because I've seen things in my short time here that make their way up to agenda review committee, and I go, oh, that's an interesting idea or a piece of information. Where did it come from? Well, it came from a master plan decision 3 years earlier. It's not on this council's work plan. It might not necessarily be a priority today. And I think we're trying to find a way to harmonize that and make sense of that.
Thank you. I'm glad you're saying that, Mr. City Manager, because my follow-up actually was, so if I heard you correctly, what you're suggesting then is that all master plans, CIP operating should be or will be discussed as soon as possible after a new election with the new council. Did I hear you? Are you suggesting that? Because that's
yes,
what I believe needs. That's what I believe needs to happen.
Yes, that would be the intent.
Oh, okay, perfect. My next question, and again, I'm sorry if I'm picking things up incorrectly, but what I thought I heard is a process where I think Councillor Carlson kind of also picked up on it somewhat, and I'd like to just expand on that a bit. So I'm gonna go back, and I know maybe Councillor Kaufman and Councillor Parker, if he was here, would maybe understand a little bit more where I'm leading with this. So I'm finding that over time, council's role has been eroded because of the committees that council has created. And so if I heard you correctly, Mr. Woods, you're going to have, the way this process is that these SPCs are going to do a bunch of work, make a bunch of decisions, get it, as Councillor Carlson said, get it to the council, and then it's going to go back to the SPC. I'm kind of struggling with that whole process because, as I stated earlier, I feel that council's role, the 9 that are elected, has kind of been eroded. Where when it gets to council, a lot of colleagues of mine will say the work's already been done. The committee's done all the work, so we just say yes, which I have a problem with that. So is that what I picked up from you? Because if that's the case, I sure don't agree with that process. I believe it should be council, the 9, getting more involved at the beginning and following through and leading the charge rather than all these subcommittees and committees and committees. Can I just get clarification on that from you? Thank you.
The question was to Mr. Woods. Mr. Van, will you put your hand up and your mic is off?
Anybody can answer that, city manager, whoever.
The city manager's on now. Do you want, let's start with the city manager.
Yeah, I'll take a start and say what I believe Mr. Woods was presenting was what it might look like in the current governance structure, but ultimately it's up to council. From our perspective, whether it's assigned to an SPC to do more work on and come back to council, those are council decisions. From our perspective, we just think it's very important for council to be engaged at the outset of any master planning process, to clearly set the scope, to clearly articulate the touch points that they want to see respected as the work is done. So how council decides to do that between, whether it's a meeting of full council, whether it's an SPC or a combination, that's really up to council.
Mr. Woods, do you need to add to that, or is that you?
I'll just add, I agree with the city manager. I'll just add to that, that only council can fund and approve a master plan or authorize a master plan, and only council can approve or receive a master plan. But what happens in between is entirely up to council in terms of the level of oversight and whether that oversight is delegated from council to an SPC. And it's actually certainly not my purview to be part of that discussion. Guidance from the city manager would be appropriate. The other piece here that may be missing is that all of our master plans align to the municipal development plan. And so council, even if they give no further direction, has given some direction to a master plan because at the very least a master plan can't contradict the municipal development plan and actually attempts to align to it. Most of our master plans, especially the ones in the last few years, the opening within the table of contents, the opening chapter speaks to the alignment and the direction given to the consulting team or whoever it is that's preparing that master plan from the municipal development plan. So council's influence over master plans is at the very least through the municipal development plan, the approval to do it in the first place in the authority, and then receiving and approving it at the end. What happens in between is entirely up to council, and to what extent it's delegated or not is the purview of council.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I have one more if I may, or do you want me to hop out?
If you have one more, there's nobody in line, but I do have a question or two, and I have to ask if Councillor Higgin has any, so go ahead.
So my final question, and Mr. Woods, you touched on it where you talked about these master plans that overlap 2, 3, 4 councils. So, and I can't think of one right now of an example, but I'm sure we have many master plans that have existed, as we all know, from 2 councils ago, or even let's just say this council. And so now next council is going to get elected. And so the master plan that is approved by a previous council or 2 is probably got, let's say, 5 stages to that master plan. and we do the first two stages of it. How is it possible then for the new council, because I'm assuming that the new council, people that are elected because they're elected by the public, because they're hearing what the public is saying, and they may not agree to certain parts or certain segments of a master plan. How can a new council stop midstream a master plan that has already got, 2 or 3 of the stages already rolling, but the last 2 or 3 stages haven't even started and are just part of a plan? How does that give the new council any hope in changing a master plan, midstream? Because I can't see that happening, and I think that ties the hands of council. Can you help me understand that a bit?
Mr. City Manager, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll take a start at that and then ask Tony and Graham to weigh in. So I think what we're proposing in developing this hierarchy of plans and this policy that clearly identifies what master plans are in play, and assuring that an incoming council, as part of its orientation, is made aware of, as you say, work that's underway and work that might be planned. So I think this will better enable a new council, as they think about their term and what they want to accomplish, to think about whether or not they want to put the brakes on any projects that have been started, or more realistically, if they want to change the course of a master plan in a particular area. So just like any capital budget at any level of government, there's, projects will span governments. And sometimes if you're building schools or hospitals or recreation centers, whatever it is, a new council that comes in halfway through that process realistically isn't in a position to change that project per se. But there could very well be other initiatives inside of master plans that have not started yet, or there's natural gateways built into those processes, and that's something else that Tony and his team are working on as we look to improve our capital planning process, capital budget planning process, and taking a different approach to project management. That I think it'll give the council of the day greater flexibility. Will it totally, free them up? If I could use that language, no. But I think what we're proposing would again give them better flexibility to respond in an informed way if they want to change course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Hoovel, if I could just ask you to mute, please. Sorry. Thank you. A couple of observations, probably fewer questions, but more observations. I think the two, sort of going on from Councillor Morrow and understanding his frustration and knowing that I've been there. In fact, I think all members of council have been at that spot. Ultimately, service levels and capital costs are the two main sticking points for members of council. That when you have a master plan, transit master plan would be an example. More recent example, perhaps, is even the recycling master plan, something that 2 councils ago. Where are we? No, actually, a council ago. We were elected in 2017, weren't we? A council ago actually approved, and we're now seeing the implementation of something from that plan, but it's also 7 years later after that decision was made. So it's those types of touch points that I think that tend to frustrate members of council most often. So in my mind, what's being laid out here is excellent. It's unfortunate we needed a consultant to tell us that administration was frustrated because they were coming too late, and council was frustrated because we weren't providing the input at the beginning. So we kind of knew what the problem was, but we've certainly seemed to understand and are addressing it in an amazing way. But I think it's really about those touch points. If Councillor Morrow and others perhaps are upset about the fact that it's going to SPCs, then the decision points definitely need to be made at council, but the SPC can direct work. That's the place where you're doing the check-in, so that the ultimate decision obviously arrives at council. For me, it's about approval, development, and approval of doing it, development, and the approval of the document occurring within one cycle in order to establish that. But as the city manager addressed, I agree that the next council needs to immediately be brought up to speed on what's going on with master plans. And I don't know if ultimately we're working towards a dashboard of master plans that you click on to see what's there. It's incumbent upon us to read them. It's incumbent upon us to understand them. I don't know if there's a corporate philosophy about master plans, because I see it more so in some departments than others, that master plans, well, they are a planning document and a visioning document, they also become a wish list. And the moment council approves it, doesn't matter how far along that master plan is or how many councils later, and I think this is what Councillor Morrow was saying, it appears in the CIP, you know, previous council approved it. And so it becomes that sort of approach of, you approved it, you're going to build it. It may be a challenge to what you said, Mr. Woods, about the recommendations from the Rec and Culture Master Plan, that 8 of the 9 facilities or the projects were fulfilled. This is going to be a very harsh statement. It's more harsh on council than it is on administration, but that's maybe an issue where staff are providing the vision. And it's just easier for us to put our hand up and go, sure, yeah, I like that vision. It's a good vision of the community. And I don't know how we address that in the master plan process other than involving council much more than just check-in points. We've got to be participating along the way, and Council A puts its stamp on it. There's no doubt about it, especially if it's created within that cycle. And Council B and Council C are going to have to steward it. And how you navigate that, I don't know. We need to be creating the long-term plan. Absolutely. None of us disagree with it, but it's how we create those touch points and how we get still say, I'm not so sure. Yeah, it can come out in the budget deliberation. But even at that, it's less about vision and it's more about, I think as you said, Mr. Woods, it's more about, you know, fewer resources, limited resources, and trying to balance those decisions. So I have no questions in there. It's more of ramblings of an old man, and what the interface and interaction I've had as a member of council with master plans, some have been extraordinarily good, some have not been. This whole receive and file, I know a couple of administrations ago, that was seen as go ahead and do it. That's not the case. That should never be the case. But we need to have a way of understanding that master plans are required. And so that's going to come up in process. Before I get to you, Councillor Carlson, if it's okay, Councillor Hagan put his hand up. Go ahead, Councillor Hagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is great conversation. I honestly wish that we had all council on this, because this is a framework that's really is what I think we've all been looking forward to hearing about for quite some time. So I hope that we all kind of head back to that YouTube video after and watch this, because it's great stuff. A question I have is, Mr. City Manager, you spoke about the gateway exits, I guess. And so I remember sitting down with you a couple of weeks ago, and I shared a concern about, well, gosh, if we've got this in a plan and we start something, I don't like this throwaway money. If you remember talking about that's always a concern. But you'd mentioned that, you know, it's not something you like to do, but there's times where sometimes it's better to maybe put the brakes on at a certain point before, you know, going down that road if council doesn't want it. And you might have some monies that are lost through the process. For example, if we had studies done, etc. So could you maybe talk a little bit to that and how that your experience through other government, how that works?
Yeah, and what I'll do is I'll ask Mr. Vandenhoevel to jump in, because they've been looking at stage gating. But yeah, it's very much that. And a good example would be, you know, a priority for council could be Initiative X, and the first step in that through a capital budget process could be to fund a study. But the results of that study, or the results of that study might suggest that the next step is design. But then you learn that there's actually no, let's say, a source of funding for that particular project didn't materialize. So rather than structuring the systems so that once you start, you eventually drive it to the end no matter what, stage gating allows you at various steps in that process to stop and say, have we met the right criteria? And council can help set those criteria and those triggers to move to the next stage. So, you know, one of the downsides is from time to time, yes, you could spend money on a study that ultimately does not result in a project moving forward. But the upside is that a good decision was made, because the conditions in the environment were not met, the triggers weren't met, and at that time it was not the best way to spend taxpayers' money. But I'll defer to Tony, because I know they've been doing some work in this area.
Thank you. And so, Councillor Higgin, a good example would be in the area of capital projects. Outside of municipal government, capital projects don't arrive on a planned schedule based on a budgeting cycle. They often arrive out of a need and necessity, right? And a bunch of work and planning and effort goes in all along the way, and then you visit your funding source if required at the end, and then you move through the implementation all the way through life cycle and everything. And one of the things that we've been looking at with the current capital improvement program as a budgeting exercises of how to take ideas, because ideas could happen, like if council passed the CIP, for example, next week, the following Wednesday, somebody could come up with an idea, right? And so how do we capture those ideas at the right time, and how do we flow them through the proper development of ideas so that council has many touch points and decisions in which they can say go or no go along the way. And so you will spend, and by the time we get to a final construction decision, or the final, you know, we're gonna go into full scale design and then followed by construction type decision, council's had a chance to vet that project along the way and evaluate it so that you're not trapped with an all or nothing decision of construction, not construction. And so one of the things we're looking at is how, and it extends to master plans as a generator of capital ideas, but it's also saying we got to be back in front of council more than the green light to go and the end result to say come cut a ribbon. And if we can do that with the stage gating process, a little bit more intensive, but ultimately I think we can move it to a where the capital budget will meet the requirements of the MGA, but the decision making and the quality of the products being deliberated happen in a streamed basis throughout council's term. And so I wish I had a whiteboard to draw it for you right now. That's
I know you like your whiteboard.
kind of the process that we've been examining and thinking about, and finding all those points where council can say, keep going or stop, and we will proceed at a different time, or stop and kill the project.
Because I mean, it always depends, obviously, on the what's going on throughout the world, or a prime example we're going through now. Sometimes that exit, rather than putting good money after bad, and maybe that's not the right way to put it, but to stop and have a look and lose less than more is the way to go, and that would give us more of an opportunity at these gateway check-ins then, obviously. And
then for us uniquely, and most importantly, is we do have to be considerate to where the funding comes from. And if it's the ability to access other level of government funding that happens, a stream process might even give you more quote unquote what we use the term shovel ready projects, because otherwise we're following a 4-year cycle of ramp up, get all the community ideas, present them, have council try and decide upon them based on limited resources, pitting them against each other. So I mean, there is some work to do, but we've got a good basis to that underway.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Dalton, Mr. Van Hoovel, and Mr. Chair. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Councillor Higgin. Councillor Higgin, you should know that the city manager and I are pooling our resources. We're going to get you a giant leaf banner for your back wall there to get you through the next couple of rounds of hockey. Councillor Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some other questions, maybe some thoughts, but I'll lead off with the first question. This is in front of us today for what? Just feedback? Because we're going all over the place.
Yeah, it's just feedback, and despite the fact that it may feel like we're going all over the place, this has been, from our perspective, this has been and will be beneficial, because we're trying to build a model that will present to the next council. And so we're really selfishly tapping into your, what's worked well, what are your frustrations working through these processes, and really help us. And if we have an opportunity, and I don't know how much opportunity we'll have, but if we could come back with where where that work progresses to over the next couple of 3 months, that would be helpful as well. But that's really our intent.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll just provide some of my comments and feedback and then get out of the queue. I like what I'm seeing here. I'm going to totally contradict some of my colleagues and say I approve of and would push for the SPC stewardship model. Bringing all of these things constantly to council would make council meetings 52 hours long, because on these master plans, we have workshops, we have discussions, we have working groups, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the challenges that we have, I know we've all expressed our frustration about where we get to provide input, but the challenge I see is you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. We just did the Rec and Culture Master Plan. Right after, we had this feedback from council saying, we want more input. We want to be a stakeholder. We want to be involved. And I couldn't drag, and I don't want to shame anyone because I know we're all busy, but I couldn't drag my colleagues to those meetings. There was 2 of us who attended every single input meeting. And I begged and pleaded my colleagues to show up because what we asked for. So leaving it to council would, as a whole, would be ridiculous. If you can get a focus group at a committee level doing that work, and yes, it relies on trusting your colleagues. It relies heavily on saying, yep, they were elected as well. They're going to do good work, ask the right question, provide input, contact us for feedback, etc. So there's a level of trust there. But I think the committee, the SPC level, is the right way to go. So that's my input. I like what I see here. Appreciate you bringing it here for discussions. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Sensitive to the time, we've been on this for nearly an hour and a half now. Oh, Councillor Morrow.
Mr. Chair, sorry, can I add to that?
Yep, go ahead.
I mean, I understand what Councillor Carlson is saying, but I'm kind of, with some of his comments, I'm taking it that, you know, we're going all over the place, and I'm taking that personal. But listen, none of us, or I'll speak for me, if we're going all over the place, we haven't said that the SPCs, you know, aren't working, but we had CIC meetings. So isn't that pretty much the same thing? We took CIC and we created these SPCs. So I'm sorry, you know, if we're gonna talk about process, and you know, we used to meet every Monday. Now we meet every second Monday. What happened to the CICs? And who cares if we got to put in 52 hours? You guys want to have full-time counselors? I'm sorry, I need to vent here. You just talked about wanting full-time counselors, and yet you're pitching and complaining about the hours that a counselor has to put in. So,
yes, Mr. Chair.
I'm just going to jump in between both of you. Thank you, Councillor Morrow, as well. I understand what you're saying. I didn't necessarily agree with Councillor Carlson's comment about being all over the board either. I think this was the input that staff were looking for.
Thank you.
I keep my eye on the clock because I recognize we've got a couple of other things that we need to address as well. And I appreciate everybody has a different opinion about the way we need to be doing things. At the moment, what's in front of us is this proposal from staff, which we will now move to a motion. If you could put that up on the screen, Mr. Westerson, I believe there's a motion involved with that as well. So I have a motion from Councillor Morrow. Be it resolved that the Governance Standing Policy Committee received the Planning Alignment Framework Initiative as in attachment. Is it really attachment X, or are we looking to number that? 1, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Moncrief, for information. Councillor Morrow?
I think we've had a good chance at chatting. I'll just call the question.
Excellent, thank you. Questions be called. Is anybody opposed? I hear no opposition, so that carries unanimously. Thank you. 4.2, back to Mr. Vanden Heuvel.
Okay, thank you. We'll head into the next part of our presentation today. Again, the intent here is to solicit questions, feedback, and input from council. So next slide, please. When we were last here talking about the work that OPCI had undertaken, we shared this slide about a good organization needs to know where they're going, need to have a plan to get there. Today, we're here to talk about how are we doing along the way and the concepts of measurement and accountability. Next slide. We're here because, again, from a KPMG phase 1 recommendation, it highlighted for us that the city lacks an overall integrated performance management framework, which we've been working on, but it also does not use key performance indicators to evaluate performance and does not hold business units accountable for achieving expected performance standards and outcomes that would be directed by council. So we're here to fulfill the recommendations. Where our intention in doing so is to have this reach across the organization, and our organization's at various stages of maturity in the whole area of performance measurement and management. But before we go down a path, we believe that's essential that we understand and meet council's needs in this area. And so one of the questions that we're going to be thinking about, and I would like you to think about through the context of this presentation, is which measures are going to be most meaningful to council. Next slide, please. So why would you measure performance? There's a lot of reasons. You measure progress, you measure output, you measure outcomes, you measure to learn, you measure to improve, you measure to be able to make decisions. And in this whole arena, Peter Drucker said it well and said it first, is what gets measured gets managed. And so when council gives us clear direction and decisions and puts that target out there for us, that's where we will be headed towards. And so it's very important that we select the right measures and the right targets that will align those resources and the progress of our projects and performance along the way. Next slide, please. This area is not new. It's been utilized in the private sector for years and years and years. It's been utilized in the public sector for as many years. The country of New Zealand has its own document for the entire nation of how they work with and do this. There's a lot of buzzwords out there, right? And there's the language where people use KPIs, or critical success boards, and dashboards, etc. And what we want to make sure that doing this properly and to serve council well and serve the organization well is we want to make sure that we're focused on what matters. We do not do this from a paralysis standpoint of metrics overload. We do it with a philosophy and a culture of measurement to learn and improve, and not a gotcha game of shame and blame. And then we make sure that we have a shared understanding of the language and the terminology that we use for the city of Lethbridge, and we'll use things so everybody has a shared understanding that every KPI is a metric, but perhaps not every metric is a KPI. And so there's a little bit of an educational component that all of us together will go on a journey to arrive at the Lethbridge solution. Next slide, please. To be successful, we're going to start very, very basic, right? We're going to have the Mazda B2000 version of a performance metric system implemented so that it serves the purpose of getting us from point A to point B and learning and understanding. And as we learn and grow together and make the improvements and see the value of having the measurement and accountability built into the performance management framework, we will then make our improvements, and fancy will come later. Next slide, please. There's a lot of things that we can measure. The inputs, the outputs, ratios, outcomes, benchmarks where we compare ourselves against other municipalities. Those are examples of the different types of things that council has seen or has seen in the past. Just some examples to warm up your thinking. Next slide, please. Organizationally, we feel strongly about undertaking this in a logic model type methodology. And we look at it as in a growth stage here where we start with operations, the day-to-day of what the work we do. And so we look at the inputs that we take, the processes that we do, the services delivery, and what it is that we produce. And we measure how we're doing with regards to accomplishments within our projects in our day-to-day. But we also have a responsibility collectively led by council and supported by administration to make sure we care for the community where it's going and where it's going to be in the future. And so we start to look about where we're going to be in the future, and we start to build strategies of how we can then move towards that. So we got to be looking at end outcome measures that council wants to see, as well as how we do along with the path to the strategy. And all of those combined, they use the terminology here, business intelligence increases, and that will drive, and we would have saw in the last presentation of 2 months ago, where really the better job that we do in this area, the better information will be brought forward to council, and council will have greater confidence in the decision-making ability because it will be based on data, information, and reproducible and all that. So it's all about equipping council and ourselves with the right information at the right time that we can improve with. Next slide, please. Some characteristics of what would be good metrics. It's evidence about progress. It's used to help inform better decision making, and it's a comparison of trending over time, so we can see how we're moving along, and then it can identify if there's any changes in those trends, or if we need to stop and examine that type of stuff. You can track things such as efficiency, effectiveness, quality, timeliness, security, governance, compliance, all those types of things you can track. But again, I will remind us that we want to make sure we're tracking what's wildly important, and we're making sure that we're hitting the marks that the council sets out. They have to be valid and verifiable and reproducible. So they got to be based on data, right? And there's going to be a balance between leading and lagging indicators. And the best example I can give in leading and lagging indicators, if I said from a for-profit enterprise standpoint, I want to grow my sales by 40% over last year's top line within the first 9 months of the next calendar year, I've now set a target that says I'm going to grow, let's say, $10 million top line growth in sales. And then you say, well, how am I going to do that? And that's where we get to the leading indicators of saying, are my salesmen out deployed full force, meeting with customers on a daily basis? And you measure the number of interactions with customers. You measure the volume and the size of the transaction. You remember the number of transactions with the same customer. And all those behaviors, those leading behaviors, will help move towards that target of $10 million. So there can be stretch measures that council will provide that says, administration, we want to be able to see this happen. And then we step back and say, what are all the steps along the way that we need to measure that will bring that final community outcome that council's seeking for? Next step, or slide, sorry. Here's some examples that exist already. So if you're looking at accuracy, you've got to make sure our utility bills are correct all the time. If you're looking at timeliness, it could relate to fire or it could relate to transit. Reliability, that every time that we go to switch the electric on, it's on. Access, does everybody have access to the recycling depots? We talk about water quality. You can look at quantity or capacity, which is a utilization measure. Aesthetics, and that's very difficult to measure, but you can't operate in our environment without having some thought towards how somebody might feel in a particular place at a particular time. And then basically access and availability. So those are examples of the type of performance measures that we can introduce council might want to have knowledge and reporting on. Next slide, please. So this is going to show really a logic model type methodology, and I'll go through this part fairly quick because at the end is where we really want to hear from council there. But we use this model from the purposes of our business planning, and out of our business planning, we're going to be attaching the measures to it. So the next slide says, typical logic model will show us in this coffee example is what is the cost of the beans? Ms. Moncrief, if you could just advance that one. Thank you. What are the costs of the beans and what are the costs of the water and the process of making it and what is produced, but then what the final outcome is. So when we do the next slide, it'll show us take that logic model thinking and apply it to an example. And this is only an example. It's not necessarily factual in any area, but that will apply to the service of 311. So if you next slide, you'll see what our inputs are. and we receive a budget from council, we have staff, and then we have infrastructure and equipment. And then we talk about what services do the 311 provide, what outputs do they have, and ultimately, what are the outcomes that council is seeking? Next slide. So we take our amount per year, annualized, and the number of FTEs, and we focus in the service area of customer care. And what are the activities? Well, we've got to look at the number of calls that are coming in. But if we do the right things, we should be able to measure customer satisfaction with the interaction on those calls. Next slide, please. In our departments, they're not always limited to just one program area. They'll have other things that they're going to be looking at. So we have to make sure that the measures are balanced and prioritized, so that even though different program areas are going to require different focusings, we don't want to be in an area of conflicting and only focusing on one measure. We have to make sure we're telling the whole story. Next slide. So we can count activities, we can count efficiencies or costs and inputs and outputs. Next slide. But really driving towards improved customer satisfaction and the community outcome of being improved citizen satisfaction. Next slide. So there it is, all one shot. And that's the type of model that we'll be following along with the department basis. And again, understanding that every department's at a different stage in its maturity with the use of metrics. So we will be building this in a crawl, walk, one process, learning from each other as we go. The next slide is a really important one, and it came from an article from the KPI Institute. And this really relates to governance role in performance measurement. And we've been reaching out to our colleagues. We met with the city of Calgary the other day and learned how they're doing it. And one of the things that we learned is the city of Calgary in two particular areas of policy have given policy direction to the organization in the area of performance measurement and management. When we met with the city of Denver, so we're looking at what other municipalities are doing and what other touch points and experiences they had with their council. But council's role as governance here, and the article speaks about as governance of an organization, if you invest in performance management skills and work together with administration for the design of the measures that you're interested in, and we look at trends over time and changing those trends and understanding that we're growing this together and learning together, focus on those strategic measures that are of primary importance to council, and role model the use of performance measurement and management, you will be able to then achieve the results on the right side. Is you're going to be able to monitor how well we're progressing towards your strategic objectives. You're going to be look both at operational information and financial information. It helps support from a leadership standpoint that culture of continuous improvement. It gives council the ability to monitor and manage risk. And then we're also, again, we're looking at all aspects. So on a balanced scorecard type thing, we'd be looking at customer metrics, operational metrics, people metrics, and financial metrics. And that lens then says, that gives us a fairly good indicator of the health of the departments, health of the divisions, health of the organization, and ultimately be able to translate this right out to where we one day will be able to have a process where we're reporting on our success and our achievement and able to tell our story to the community. So I'll end with that, and I'll open it up for your guys' questions, input, discussion, and feedback. We'll do the same, similar to Graham's presentation, because what we're here today is to learn and listen to you guys. So we'll open it up and let the conversation go where you guys would like it to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vanden Heuvel. Members of the committee, or Councillor Hagan. Councillor Croson.
Thank you. Thank you very much for putting in some of those aesthetic measures and things like that, ones that are hard to measure, but are absolutely vital. And I know that's going to be one of the tricky points, is how to actually measure that. Because, people do, you could measure how long the grass is, but that might not be what people are cared about. It's the weeds, it's everything else. So I am curious, how are you thinking of trying to capture that qualitative aesthetic measurement? What's the thinking right now and how you'll achieve that?
So Thank you for the question, and you're right. It is difficult to measure in those areas, but they are important. And one of the tools that you would design in an area to get that type of feedback is you can measure throughput and measurable activities and data and all that. But if you do a customer or citizen survey, or we engage with specific feedback and focus groups that might be high users of everything, and we can capture their qualitative comments that they were willing to share and their experience and how they feel. Those types of things can be summarized, themed, and presented to council as well. So they at least have that level of pulse beyond pure numerical data.
So we do the citizen satisfaction survey, but what you're recommending and going ahead is that the two are connected, so that the KPI and the citizen satisfaction survey are done in a way that they can be coordinated or to, complement each other. Is that correct?
Very much complementary of each other. And it can be designed. So the example that we used in the PowerPoint there was the aesthetic of the cemeteries, right? That may be basically folks sitting and interacting with folks that are visiting and capturing that stuff for a period of time. And then we may move to parks for a similar type thing. Or we globally may do it by asking callers that call in the 311, we have the following questions for you. But there is ways of capturing it, focused and broadly, but we match that up against some of the other measures that are operational in nature, let's say.
Okay, let's link the two conversations we've had today. If we were developing a master plan, or you said to this department, we know you need a master plan, will the KPIs and metrics for that be developed in the beginning? Would it be developed as part of the master plan? How are these two going to connect?
So that's a great question. I think part of this performance measurement and management is integral to the framework that we're standing up for the organization. And when I say it's integral, it then needs to become part of the conversation all along the different processes. So I would suggest it needs to be contemplated in the scope and the delivery start of things, right? And it needs to be thought of at that stage. And as information becomes better, it can be adjusted or tweaked or better informed, changed. But then at the outcome stage or the implementation stage, we have to have some agreement of what these measures are. But one of the strongest comments we had with our colleagues in Denver this morning was, you know what? Sometimes measures are going to change. And those measures, it's okay to change those measures. But when you have an entire organization led by city council thinking about it as a part of the way that they do the work so that they're able to tell their story, that learning process might say, 1 year we measured this, but it didn't really tell us really what we kind of knew we wanted to share. So let's tweak that and try something else, right? And so, yes, at the beginning, continuous improvement attached, but absolutely through the implementation stage, there should be agreed upon metrics that council says, this is what we want to know out of this master planning exercise.
I'm glad to hear you say that, what we measure can be changed, because what I've seen when I've been looking at this is a measurement system can enhance innovation or stifle innovation. If you stick to it too much and say, this is the only thing we care about, then people never feel they can be innovative, going, well, actually what we've been measuring has actually limited us. So how do you ensure innovation even though you have specific measurements? If that question makes sense.
Makes very good sense, and it's an important question for all of us to consider as we do this, is because if we are absolutely rigid in our approach, right, you're gonna if you only focus on one thing, you're gonna get that thing, right? And that Hawthorne effect, and people will, if you put the net there, people will find a way to put the puck in there. So you need to make sure that you make sure you're putting the net in the place. So two ways of looking at it is, one, across the balanced scorecard, is to make sure that we're looking at not just operational metrics and not just financial metrics, but we're contemplating customer metrics and our people metrics all along the way. So it gives us a balanced view and approach to how we do this. The second way of doing it, and I think when it comes to the concept or the idea of creativity, is creativity actually happens within defined boundaries. I'm gonna have to close the door before Councilor Morrow gets mad.
I was wanting to hear what the dog's input was on this.
I think school must be out now. So when you look at creativity, and I'll use a sporting analogy because it's a way that I can express it. But if you look at a football field, it has defined rules, defined times, defined lines, defined measurements all along the way. And everybody knows the rules in which they play. The creativity within those defined boundaries is what allows people to uniquely find a way to achieve the results that they're looking for. So creativity actually blossoms with structure.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it to your point, though, one of your points, Councillor Croson, is I often say measurement's not a science, it's an art. But it's not that black and white. It's clearly a little bit of both. And measurement is not an end in and of itself. It's really, as Tony was saying, it's about learning and improving. But you know, your question earlier about how do you remain flexible, ensure that the measures you select actually drive the behaviors you want, and create an environment where people innovate in response to feedback. That's something that Tony said has to be in the forefront of our minds as we think about what measures we're going to select. And when you mentioned that question, a case study I remember reading about popped into my mind where in the UK, one of their measures for regional health systems, their one primary measure actually that drove funding was how long did patients sit in waiting rooms. And so they quickly realized that to get the funding, to maximize funding, they didn't need people sitting in waiting rooms. So what happened was there started to be queues of ambulances outside of hospitals. And so people weren't getting the care they needed because they didn't want them to be in the waiting room for too long because they wouldn't get the funding. And then there was an ambulance availability issue and the response time for ambulances went down. And so it just an example of where measurement really, really matters. It's not something you can just slap something on the wall. You have to be thoughtful. And the other observation I make is we can't measure everything. We need to be selective. We need to, and I'm a fan, for example, of to start, let's have every operational element in the corporation on the administrative side start to think from an outcome perspective. Identify a measure that will help them understand and be able to answer the question, are we doing a good job? Are we meeting our customers' needs? Just one thing. And it'll evolve over time. It'll change over time. But thinking about and answering that question would lead you to innovate. Unless you're knocking it out of the park all the time, which most organizations don't, you'll run into problems you didn't anticipate. That then, as Tony said, inside a structured environment, drives and enables that innovation. So it's I know a lot of folks say, measure, but it has to be done in a thoughtful way.
So at the center of everything, the measurements chosen will always be, is this serving the customers, the residents of Lethbridge?
Yeah, and to me, the question we should all be asking ourselves all the time is, are we doing a good job? And how do you know that? You don't know that unless you think and say, well, how would I answer that? What outcome am I actually trying to achieve, and how would I measure that? And it to me, that's the core question.
So yeah, so that's the purpose of why we're doing this, because I mean, we get asked this, right? Why are you guys looking at measuring? It's to know that we're serving the community as well as we can.
Yeah, and to Tony's point too, part of this is self-serving. When he talked about telling our story, who tells our story today? Not us. Sometimes we do, but by and large, it's other people. And our story is told by exception. It's told by letters to the editor. It's we don't serve ourselves well by demonstrating a clear focus on customer service described as outcomes, by measuring and celebrating the many successes that we have and telling that story. And so when Tony talked about not naming, blaming, and shaming, but actually doing this to learn, one of the positive things that emerges in organizations that measure and measure well and improve is they tell that story. They succeed. They celebrate those successes. And we live in a time, frankly, when we don't celebrate successes often enough, and the conversation often goes to perceived failures or failures, which are important to stop and consider. But I think telling our story for the health of the organization is an important part of this as well.
And the measurements will be right across the organization, because one of the things I don't think a lot of people realize is exactly what is a city department and how much they're getting from the city, but they don't think of it as city stuff. So it will affect all of city organizations?
That's the plan, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And it would be great to have in a very simple world, starting with council, how would council define success? So when a new council comes together, they're going to have a council strategic plan. Clearly, progress in those priorities, much like yours, that's part of defining success. But from a customer service perspective, for the services we deliver, what is that standard we're trying to achieve? What does success look like? As Tony mentioned, in many cases, you can only really understand that through customer satisfaction surveys, but identifying that. And I've been on the board of a Crown corporation that was service delivery oriented. And one of the key things we checked in on at every board meeting was, what's our customer service index for the month? We had a target band, and it was one. And if it had slipped, why? And it really drove conversations around improvement. So we have to, I think, caution against letting this be too big. But I think we can comfortably land on a dashboard for the public, for council, for administration, that provides meaningful feedback and helps us innovate and evolve. And there's another, a couple of examples have popped up listening to Tony walk through the presentation, that from a council perspective. One was a number of months ago, council directed money be allocated to a rent relief program for individuals who were negatively impacted by COVID and the shutdowns. There's a great example of, from a council perspective, how could a formal measurement program help? Well, we have provided some feedback to council in terms of uptake on that program or how much money was dispersed. But really, report on that and in line with the framework Tony shared. How much money's gone out the door? How many people have been helped? But then, or taken advantage of that program. But then, from an outcome perspective, what was the real outcome of that program? Was that a good decision? Was it sound? Did it achieve the desired outcomes that council had set? And the likely answer is probably yes, but there are things we could learn. But really, without a formal process in place, we've just moved on to the next issue, the next challenge. And culturally, we got to get to the point where we think strategically and we say, okay, when we develop that program and design it, what's the definition of success? What KPI are we seeking? And then we've got to measure that, report on that, and when we're done, we move on to the next initiative. But this is something that we need to, I believe, embed in our culture in a number of ways.
No, I know I've said it to you before, but that's been the hardest part, is we don't know if things are successful. We get lots of numbers back, but we don't know, does that mean it was good or not? We don't know. And I'm so happy you're moving towards this, because this will support any future councils. Thank you, Chair. I know I asked more than 2 questions.
No problem. I don't see other hands at the moment. Just a couple of things. Thank you, Mr. Vandenhoevel, for the information. And sort of on Councillor Croson's final statement there, I think it's for various points within the organization to sort of determine or state that success. Council definitely has to be one. But we also need, and this is a bit of a corporate culture, we also need to be honest about the things that aren't working well and not be afraid to acknowledge that, and then afraid to just address it and try to change. Personal management style was always, when I was dealing with my staff, my stores, I won't be upset with you if you make a wrong decision, but I will be upset if you don't make a decision. So it's about empowering staff and engaging staff for that creativity, for that innovation. This isn't working, and that's all right. How can we make it work, or what can we do differently? So as long as we've got that honesty, there may need to be the development to Councillor Carlson's previous comment about a master plan for master plan. There may need to be guidelines established about metrics and KPIs, because if you have very little governance experience or no management experience, the establishment of a process is going to be difficult. Understanding, as you say, what you measure, what's important is what you measure. The other challenge to that I kind of see is we may be, we're kind of addressing, I guess, 4 different groups. We're addressing citizens. I'm elected by citizens. I'm not elected by customers. And when I'm elected by citizens, I'm actually elected to represent citizens, residents, and visitors. And part of that is the provision of service, whatever that service looks like. So we can measure the KPI service, but what can we do to measure citizens, residents, and visitors as well? I mean, we need to be sensitive to the fact that you're dealing with the board of directors of an organization who are responsible to people over 18 who lived in Alberta for 6 months who are Canadian citizens. We're providing services. So I don't want us to miss that component, but I have no idea necessarily how to address that component. And it's got to be, in my mind, part of the consideration. This, ultimately, this is the success point once every 4 years for the elected body. Have you made your citizens happy? Well, you don't necessarily just do that through service provision, because of a lot of decisions council makes are not necessarily tied directly to any sort of service decision. And I'm just wondering if it's possible for you to circulate to members of council the KPI Institute article as sort of a backgrounder to your information. Again, if it's sort of the starting point of conversation about measuring things as it relates especially to governance, I think it's good for council to at least establish it that way. Are there any other questions from either members of the committee or Councillor Hagan? Okay,
Councillor Kaufman?
Yes.
Could you expand on your comment about the citizen piece? And I just want to make sure I understand. Were you talking about citizen satisfaction, regardless of whether or not? So if we have a service standard X and we met that 95% of the time, are you suggesting there's that's a measure, but there's the customer or citizen satisfaction component as well? Is that just trying to understand? Make sure I understand.
Yeah, citizens and customers can be the same things, but aren't necessarily. Now, if you're a citizen, then you're a resident. You can be a resident without being a citizen, but you can't be a citizen without being a resident. So there's the utility nexus with it. So yeah, there's your provision of service, but this aspect of citizen, resident, visitor is something as well. We need to just recognize that we're not 9 customer service reps, unless that's the way we see ourselves. I don't. I see me as being democratically elected by citizens, and so there is much more than just the provision of service. That's key to what we do, absolutely, because we're utilizing taxpayer dollars to provide or meet need. But looking at it purely through the customer service lens, in my mind, and I might just be one of 4, I might just be one of 9, is missing this component as our role as representatives of citizens, representatives, and visitors to our community.
Okay, thank you. So that would be, as you mentioned, other than once every 4 years when there's direct feedback provided in that regard, are there other ways to, and it could be in the support to mayor and council realm, where measuring that sort of citizen satisfaction would be useful for council? Because
this, it maybe begs the question, is the customer service aspect a consideration of the voter when they go to the polls? Some cases, yes. In most cases, no. Actually revolves around this. How have you represented me? How have you served me as a citizen? How have you served me as a resident? You don't get to vote if you're a visitor to our community, but we have to be conscious that people come in and out of our community as well. We need to make certain that we're keeping them safe and healthy and viable and addressing their requirements as well. So maybe we'll just do these 2. I have to be very careful about what fingers I'm choosing here. So it just, to me, it's great that we measure, and we need to measure. We need to constantly be improving, absolutely. But this sometimes gets lost. We're not just customer service reps. We're democratically elected, and this is actually part of our calculation once every 4 years. It's part of the calculation of the community as well. I don't know if you can measure it. There are ways to do it. I do know that you can measure it. There are ways to do it, but again, perhaps I'm taking a soft topic, and I don't want to do that. So, is there anything else from members of any member that's present? I see we lost Councillor Campbell at some point too. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Van den Heuvel. We do have a motion Thank you. Councillor Croson, 4.2, be it resolved that the Governance Standing Policy Committee received the presentation on performance measurement management as an attachment 1 for information. Councillor Croson.
Well, thank you to everyone for all the work that's gone into this. I do think it'll be an amazing thing for council and the community to have, and I will call the question.
Seeing nothing from other members of the committee, is anyone opposed? That carries unanimously. Thank you. It is 3:24, and I'm sensitive to the fact that we have staff at City Hall, but we have the 3 submissions. Ms. Hilford, are you wanting a conversation on 5.1?
Chair Kaufman, I am here to answer any questions that committee may have or receive any feedback or amendments.
Okay, thank you. We're approaching the 2-hour mark for the meeting as well. Members of the committee, do you want a 5-minute break or should we just keep continuing on? Is this thing on? Hello? Hello?
I say continue if there's nobody saying anything different.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Westerson, can we do a quick roll call, please?
Certainly. Councillor Morrow.
Yeah.
Councillor Carlson.
Present.
Councillor Croson, or sorry, acting
Here.
Ms. Croson.
I'm here.
And Councillor Kaufman.
Present. Thank you. Okay, we'll continue on to 5.1. Members of council or members of the Standing Policy Committee would have received this yesterday, I believe. Any questions? Ms. Hilford, did you want to just, I don't want to get into another presentation, but was there anything you wanted to highlight or address?
Thank you, Chair Kaufman and members of the committee. As I said, I didn't have a presentation. I've been before committee on this topic before, and you're familiar with it because you've gone through orientation. So just, again, want to receive any feedback or any revisions before it gets adopted onto council or answer any questions. The documents are pretty self-explanatory with the calendar and the content and the scheduling. But again, it's a lot of information. It was a difficult balance of information, time, and priorities. So what's being presented today is a starting point for committee and council to consider.
Thank you. One question from me, and I don't know if this has been addressed anywhere. I know that we've had the conversation several times over various councils about whether or not orientation is done publicly or in closed session or just as a session but out of public view. Is the intent to have orientation done publicly?
Chair Kaufman, thanks for the question. It was a consideration of mine, but I wanted to bring it before committee and council to see what they wanted to do. I think administration is able to do either or both or whatever committee and council desires, unless there is confidential information that's being provided. But otherwise, it is public information. We are planning to put it on the web for potential candidates that are looking to run in the election so that they understand what the months after election look like.
Okay, thank you. Any thoughts from members of the committee on that process of it being done publicly or being done as just work sessions out of the public view? Councillor Croson, I see that your camera's come on.
It's like putting my hand up. I would be fine if it was suggested to go public, because why wouldn't the community want to know what new council is learning? There's, it's only about process, and it's a chance for the community to learn about the process as well, to learn along with the new council. So I would recommend that as much of it be publicly done as possible.
Okay, any additional thoughts? Okay, hearing none. Any questions on the 2021 Council Orientation and Transition Program? And And hearing none, thank you, Mr. Westerson, or Ms. Moncrief. I have a motion from Councillor Morrow, 2021 Council Orientation and Transition Program. Be it resolved, the Governance Standing Policy Committee recommend that Council adopt the 2021 Council Orientation and Transition Program as provided in attachments 1, 2, and 3. Councillor Morrow.
Question.
Question has been called. Is anybody opposed? Hearing none, that is carried unanimously. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Helford, to you and your staff for all of the work on that. And thank you for the work that commences November 1st or whatever day you start orientation.
Thank you, Chair Kaufman and committee.
Item 5.2, operational review implementation. Plan update. Thank you, Ms. Moncrief. If you could just scroll it a little bit more. Thank you very much. Thank you. Any update, any question, anything, Mr. City Manager, Mr. Gauthier, I think that one might be yours.
Nothing specific to highlight, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Any questions to City Manager or staff? Okay, seeing or hearing none, I've got a motion from Councillor Carlson. Operational Review Implementation Plan Update. Be it resolved, the Governance Standing Policy Committee received the Operational Review Implementation Plan as an attachment 1 for information. Councillor Carlson.
Question.
Question has been called. Anyone opposed? Hearing none, that carries unanimously. Thank you. 5.3, Council Work Plan, monthly update, May 2021. Mr. City Manager, anything to highlight?
Nope, nothing to pull out.
Thank you. Any questions from members of the committee or others? Okay, hearing none. I have a motion from Councillor Crowson. Be it resolved that Governance Standing Policy Committee recommend that City Council receive the Council Work Plan monthly update, May 2021, as an attachment 1 for information. Councillor Crowson.
Question.
Question has been called. Is anyone opposed? Hearing none, that carries unanimously. I think the next thing was, advisory committee update. Sorry, I don't have the agenda. I just have the motions. Is that the next thing on the agenda?
That is, and there's nothing attached, Mr. Chair.
Well, it's because we haven't met. The advisory committee is actually meeting tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock, Ms. Hilford. Is that correct? Yes, I believe that's correct. 1 o'clock tomorrow. So I will have an update on that at the next meeting. For the knowledge of the SPC. So we just have one final motion from Councillor Morrow. Be it resolved that we do now adjourn the Governance Standing Policy Committee meeting until Thursday, June 24th, 2021. Councillor Morrow.
Thanks for chairing, Mr. Chair. Great job. Call the question.
Question has been called. Anyone opposed? Hearing none, we are adjourned. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Dalton, to you and your staff for all of the work and all of the information presented today. Thank you, members of the committee, and thank you, Councillor Hagan, for attending as well. Stay safe.
Chair.
Thank you. Go Oilers.